Yeah, Allison, a big day here in Britain, and one that a lot of people here had been waiting for quite a long time. Because remember, a lot of other Western European countries that were really hard hit by the virus, like Britain, have opened up weeks ago. They no longer look the way Britain does. And when I walk around on the streets of London, you can tell there's just not a lot of people still around. Nothing's open. The restaurants, for the most part, are shut. And there's no inside table waiting service for any of those places. But now, Britons were very happy to hear Prime Minister Boris Johnson addressing the country and announcing that on July 4th, restaurants, pubs, hairdressers, and a variety of other businesses are going to be allowed to reopen and actually greet customers indoors. That's going to be a huge change of the quality of life here. He did say that Britons need to remain vigilant, but he also reduced the social distancing guideline from 2 meters to 1 meter. And he said that if you can, of course, try to keep the 2 meters, but reducing it to 1 meter, try to use other methods to control the spread of the virus, like wearing masks and gloves and that sort of thing. But that is one of the things that made headlines, because for a lot of Britons, that shows that there is no longer this sky-high concern about the spread of the virus. Because remember, Britain is one of the worst afflicted countries in the world, and it's had one of the longest lockdowns in the world. So now Britons are going to be able to spend a little bit more time getting socially back together again.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.